Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're doing well. In today's video I want to give you some tips and tricks to help you establish your newly set up aquascape or planted aquarium. Because we all know that the first few weeks are actually very crucial. The aquarium is not balanced yet and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. We can run into algae issues and plants may not be growing, or the water quality might not be optimal. And I was sort of browsing through YouTube and I actually could not find a lot of videos about this topic. I mean, there's thousands of videos about how to set up an aquascape, but then the period that comes after that, there's very little information about that. And I think in those first few weeks when things are evolving and the aquarium is trying to balance itself, things are happening inside the aquarium, some algae might occur, and that's where a lot of people sort of start to panic and they have a lot of questions. And it's important that we answer those questions. So I did a little brainstorming and I've managed to come up with 13 tips to help you establish your aquascape or newly planted aquarium. Okay, so let's start with tip number 1, and that is to slowly increase your light. In the beginning, plants are not used to this very bright light, so we want to start slowly and build up to a higher intensity or a longer photo period. So for me personally, I'll take the 70 liter scapers tank as an example. When I set that one up, I started with 7 hours of light at only 50% intensity. And now it's 4 weeks old, and now I'm at 70% for 8 hours. So I'm increasing the photo period a little bit, but more so increasing the intensity. And you can do both. You can either start with a short photo period and increase that time to 8, 9, 10 hours, or you can start with a lower intensity and bring that intensity up. Now this of course depends a little bit on your light that you're using. Let's say you're using a very bright light that is not dimmable, then you just start with a very short photo period of 6 hours and you slowly build up to 8, 9, 10 hours. If you have a light that is dimmable, then you can still start at a longer photo period but less intensity and just build up the intensity. And the best thing about plants is that they will actually tell you when they've had enough light. Especially stem plants like Tropica, for example. When they had enough light, they will start to close up and you can easily tell, like, okay, they've had enough, we can switch the light off. So that's tip number 1, slowly increase your light. Okay, tip number 2 is to hold off on liquid fertilizers. Some people might not agree with this, but I think in the beginning, when plants are freshly planted and they still have to adapt to their new environment, they're not really growing much, and so they don't really need liquid fertilizers. And this also applies to people who are using some sort of aqua soil. In the very first few weeks of your new aquascape, that soil is releasing a lot of nutrients. So these are plenty enough nutrients for your plants, and we don't need to supplement it with extra liquid fertilizers. So it depends a little bit on the soil that I'm using, but I usually start somewhere around after 3 weeks. I'll start with like half a dose of liquid fertilizers. So the first 3 weeks I'm not dosing anything. I'm just relying on the nutrients from the aqua soil to supplement the plants basically. Now if you're not using a soil-based substrate, this is a different story of course. I would say if you're not using any soil, I would still wait at least 1 week before I would start dosing any nutrients. So maybe start with half a dose of nutrients after the first week. Now some people might not agree with this. I know a lot of people like to have an abundance of nutrients in the water column so your plants will never starve. And I see the logic in that, but in my opinion, having excess nutrients in the water column just is a trigger for algae. Okay, tip number 3 is to inject enough CO2. Now this is of course always important, but especially during the startup, we want to make sure we have enough CO2 in the water, and we want to make sure we don't have any fluctuations in the CO2 levels. I get a lot of people asking me about how many bubbles per second I'm using in my tanks, but that's not a good way to measure things, because there are so many variables like light, flow, how big your CO2 bubbles are, if they are fully dissolving in the water or not. So the best way for me to know if you have enough CO2 in the water is just by using a drop checker. It's so easy. You can read the color of the solution. If it's blue, it's not enough. If it's green, it's perfect. And if it's yellow, it's too much. Now me personally, I always like to go for a little bit lime green, So I'm always a bit high on CO2, but not high enough that they can be dangerous for the fish or whatever. Okay, tip number 4 is do your regular water changes. Now this one is maybe a bit obvious, but especially in the beginning, it can be a little bit confusing of how many water changes you need to do. And a lot of it also depends on the substrate that you're using. So if you're using a soil-based substrate, aqua soil, then you need to do more regular water changes than a person who is just using a regular inert gravel. And if you are using a soil-based substrate, it also really depends on the brand of soil that you're using. Because with ADA Amazonia, you need to do a water change every day for the first week, and then every other day the second week, etc, etc. If you're using Tropica soil, they suggest to do a water change 2 or 3 times a week. Me personally, I like to use the Dental Escaper soil, and they didn't say anything about doing water changes. So I asked the representative, and he said that they recommend to do a water change, 100% water change after the initial setup the next day, and then another water change in that same week, and after that every 2 weeks a water change. So it really depends on the brand, and also it depends on your personal preference, of course. Me personally, I like to do a water change, a 50% water change every week. Tip number 5 is to plant heavy from the start. That's a mistake that I used to make in the past. Whenever I would set up a new aquascape, I would select the plants and I would buy 1 pot of each plant that I want to use. Because I thought to myself, those plants, they will grow and eventually I'll have plenty of plants. But in your aquarium, there's a constant battle going on between algae and plants. And if you don't have a lot of plants, then the chance of them winning that battle is very slim. So from the very beginning, you always want to start So from the beginning, you always want to start with a lot of plants. So I would never suggest to save money on plants. Okay, tip number 6 is very underrated, but will really help you establish your aquascape faster, and that is the use of fast-growing plants. Now, even if you don't like the look of these plants, I would suggest just use them temporarily, and once your aquarium is established, you can give them away to somebody. But these fast-growing plants, they are the worst enemy for algae, and they will help you establish your aquascape a lot quicker. Some of these plants are, for example, Limnophila sessiliflora is a very good fast-growing plant. Hygrophila polysperma is a very fast-growing plant, and I'll leave a few more names on the screen. Tip number 7 is again a plant related, and that is the use of floating plants. Again, very underrated in my opinion, but floating plants, they're amazing, because they float on the surface. They have unlimited access to CO2 that's in the air, and with their roots they soak up a lot of nutrients. So again, these are the worst enemy for algae. And this one is especially good for people who might have a very strong light that is non-dimmable. If you have a few floating plants, these floating plants, they will also dim the light a little bit, which can be especially helpful in the very first few weeks. Okay, tip number 8 is to use a cleanup crew. If you look at the experts, let's say the aquariums from the Green Aqua Gallery or the Aqua Designer Mano Gallery, if you look at these aquariums, they all have the same inhabitants. They all have Amano shrimp, they'll have some Cleton snails, they'll have Otocinclus, they'll have Siamese algae eaters, and that's for a very good reason. These fish and these shrimp and snails, they'll make your life so much easier, and they'll do all the hard work for you. Me personally, my favorite are Otocinclus catfish. They are such a great algae eater, especially in the beginning. Usually with a freshly set up aquascape, after about 3 weeks we'll run into diatoms, brown algae, and that's when a lot of people start to panic, oh, what's happening, what do I have to do now? And if you just add a few of these Otocinclus, they will eat those diatoms within 2 days. Within 2 days everything will be gone. Yes, tip number 9 is to add live bacteria. Now, a stable aquarium has a lot of beneficial bacteria, but a newly fresh setup aquarium doesn't have any beneficial bacteria. Now, these bacteria, they will develop over time, and we don't really have to do anything about that, but we can speed up the process by adding live bacteria from the start. A product that I like to use is this special blend from ALGAE Aquatics. So these are just basically live bacteria in a bottle, and there's a lot of products like this on the market, and yeah, I really suggest that you use something like this. Another thing that you can do is, if you have multiple aquariums, you can take the filtration media from one aquarium and transfer a little bit of that into your new aquarium. So you have some cycled media that you use to start up your new aquascape. This will also help to really get nice colonies of those beneficial bacteria. Okay, tip number 10 is consistency. And this might sound a little bit silly, but we want to create a stable environment, a stable aquascape. And for that we need to be consistent, of course. So we can be consistent with our equipment, we can put our light and our CO2 on timers. That's very important. We can also be consistent with our maintenance. We do the water change on the same day every week, on the same time maybe as well. And I recommend that you do your water changes also either in the morning or in the evening, and never during the photo period and during the CO2 period, because we want our CO2 levels to be consistent as well. And let's say it's the middle of your photo period and you're going to do a water change, then that CO2 level is going to go like this. So there's a lot of things that we can be consistent about, and if we are consistent, then we can definitely have a stable aquascape. Okay, tip number 11 is patience, and that is something that's really important and also really difficult, even for me. But yeah, to create a stable environment, it can take up to 3 months to have a stable aquascape. So it's very important to be patient and to just let nature run its course. During those 3 months, there's a lot of things going to be happening. You may run into some algae, but a lot of times that is normal actually. That's just a phase that you have to go through in order to get a stable environment. For example, diatoms. Every new aquarium will run into diatoms eventually. Usually that is somewhere around week 3 or week 4, and that is just a phase that you need to go through. But a lot of times people start panicking. They like, oh, I have algae, what do I have to do now? And then they start making changes. They reduce the light all of a sudden, or they increase the CO2 all of a sudden, and that's not going to help you create a stable environment. So a lot of times you just need to be patient. Tip number 12 is to keep your water surface clean. We all know that ugly surface scum, that oily, filthy layer on top of the water surface. This is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's quite normal for it to occur, but if it gets too much, it does prevent oxygen coming into the water and CO2 leaving the water. So it can really sort of mess up the oxygen levels inside your aquarium water. So I always prefer to keep it as clean as possible. And the best way to do it is just with a surface skimmer, or you can just increase the flow, or you can run an air pump at night, something like that. Just try to keep your water surface clean. And the last tip, tip number 13, this is a smartphone app. This is the 90 days app from Tropica Aquarium Plants. And they produce this smartphone app that gives you basically a schedule of what you have to do on a day-to-day basis to get a stable environment. And I find this really handy. It gives you notifications when you need to do a water change. It gives you notifications when you might have to do some trimming. It gives you notifications when you have to start dosing liquid fertilizers. So it's really, it's a really handy guide and really handy reminder to have. Right, those were the 13 tips to help you establish a aquascape or a plant aquarium. I hope those were useful for you guys. If you think they're useful, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye.